Yeah, hello, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. We are delighted to host you, to virtually host you at IFRI today for this webinar. Our audience, as I can see, is sitting both in Asia and in Europe. So good morning and good afternoon. Indeed, the past 6 months have been critical for the Taiwanese politics, as well as for the regional security and stability. And in a nutshell, I will try to remind everyone what was the last development of this political context in Taiwan. So first of all, there was the presidential and legislative election in Taiwan on January 13. Mr. Lai Ching-te, then Vice President of the Republic of China, was elected as the new president, succeeding to Mrs. Tsai Ing-wen, who finished her second and last term. So the Democratic Progressive Party, the DPP, was then re-elected for an unprecedented third consecutive term since the popular elections began in 1996. However, we can say it is a partial victory for the DPP since it lost the majority at the Legislative Yuan. The Legislative Yuan, which is the parliament, now has a completely different face, meaning no absolute majority and a rather balanced hung parliament between the two traditional parties, the Kuomintang, the KMT, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party. The Kuomintang got a majority by 1 seat with 52 legislators, and the DPP now has 51 legislators. But another outsider party rose during this election, the Taiwan People's Party, the TPP, which got only 8 seats, but paradoxically, who gained a central position on the political scene between the two traditional parties, the KMT and the DPP. Lai Ching-te gave his inaugural speech on May 20. In his speech, he remained committed to defending Taiwan democracy, regional peace and stability, as well as Taiwan's position as a peaceful and constructive stakeholder on the world stage, just like his predecessor, Tsai Ing-wen. But in his own style and perhaps a more assertive style, this is perhaps one question that we will ask our guest speakers later on. 3 days after President Lai's inauguration, the People Liberation Army, the PLA, started a very large 2-day military drill surrounding Taiwan. It was the largest drill since August 2022, after Nancy Pelosi, then Speaker of the US House of Representatives, came to Taipei. Lai Ching-te's term started with this external pressure from the PRC, but also with a very hot domestic political crisis triggered within the Legislative Yuan and soon evolving a vast part of the civil society across the island. The crisis was started within the Legislative Yuan with a legislative reform bill proposed by the KMT, which was to drastically extend the power of the Legislative Yuan. The bill was passed, and President Lai just signed it into law yesterday. However, he also said that he will file it for constitutional interpretation. So we are still, let's say, at the beginning of this crisis, and we'll be very happy to hear what our speaker what they expect from the next development. So these are the two external and domestic challenges that we will address today with our two distinguished speakers. And what we can we will try to also address what we can expect for the future of the EU-Taiwan relations with the new political context in Taiwan, but also with the fast-moving political context in the EU, considering the election of the new parliament, European Parliament recently, and the new commission, which is in the making right now. To discuss this, I am very much delighted to welcome Professor Hongjun Wang, Director of the Institute of National Policy Research, the INPR, a leading independent think tank in Taipei. And also, I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Susa Anna Ferenczi, Assistant Professor at the National Tonghua University in Hualien, Taiwan, and Associate Research Fellow at the Institute for Security and Defense Policy, the ISDP, in Stockholm. So thank you very much, both of you, for joining us today. And just before leaving the floors to our two speakers, let me remind everyone that you can ask your questions in French or English in the chat box, the Q&R chat box on the bottom, at the bottom of your screen at any time during the discussion, and I will then pass them on to the speakers during the Q&A session. So without further ado, thank you very much again, and I leave the floor to Professor Hong Jung-Won for your initial remarks for roughly 10 minutes. Thank you again.
Thank you much. Thank you for Mark's introduction for this background. Actually, I'm responsible for the parts regarding our new government, Lai Ching-te's administration's foreign policy. I will briefly outline, I hope I correctly outline this new administration's foreign policy, and I also welcome critiques or comments from our audience. So I think from my view, the foreign policy of Lai Ching-te's administration is primarily based on two significant documents issued by Lai Ching-te himself before the election. The first document is an article submitted to the Wall Street Journal in July 2023, revealing the so-called four-pillar plan for peace. So that's the first document. The second document is a commitment made at a diplomatic reception held in Taipei in August 2023. So actually, the two documents, they outline the quite similar points about Lai Ching-te's views, world views of Taiwan's future policy. There are 4 points I just pick up from this four-pillar plan. The first point is we must build Taiwan's deterrence capabilities. So that's the first one. The second is economic security is national security. It's not just economic security. Third, the third pillar outlined by President Lai is based on establishing partnerships with democratic countries worldwide. And the fourth point is stable and principled leadership in cross-strait relations. I think President Lai emphasized that he tried to emphasize, even right now, I think he had some consistencies before and after the elections. So he emphasized that Taiwan will work with the international community to maintain the status quo, the idea of the status quo, which aligns with the former President Tsai Ing-wen's four masters, namely supporting dialogue between both sides of the Taiwan Strait under conditions of equality and dignity, maintaining the existing international order and contributing to the prosperity and welfare of the Taiwan Strait. So I think this is not only echoes former President Tsai Ing-wen's stance on maintaining the status quo, but also from Lai Ching-te's view, I think he also tried to reassure friends in the United States and the neighboring countries and the international society that the new government will not change the current cross-strait orders and will not change the stance in terms of intentions and policies. And he would like to avoid any increased risk between the two sides. On the other hand, I would like to show that actually those main concepts or points I outlined actually further elaborated by President Lai Ching-te in his inauguration speech on May 20, and also in an interview with Time magazine on June 13, particularly concerning these cross-strait relations, where President Lai Ching-te hopes that China and the international community will formally acknowledge that, according to the current constitution of Republic of China, that's the official name of Taiwan, and China the two countries are not subordinated to each other. So that's kind of the view later on elaborated further by Lai Ching-te's interview with Time magazine and the inauguration speech. So he tried to emphasize that the two countries, but the main point is according to the established constitution of Republic of China, Taiwan. Taiwan and China are two different countries. They are not subordinated to each other. Uh, let's first discuss the overall policy of Lai Ching-te's administration, we can see if anything different. I think in those documents I just illustrated, President Lai has mentioned the impact of Taiwan's external environment on Taiwan's overall security. So in terms of democracy, besides continuing to cooperate with countries that shared similar views, it is even more crucial for Taiwan to ensure its own defense capability and protect its citizens' safety. Therefore, Lai Ching-te often mentioned the concept of building Taiwan's deterrence capabilities after the election. So that's the first thing. I think he has this consistency and continue what he promised before the election. The second issue President Lai Ching-te often focused is in diplomatic work. That is economic security. I just mentioned a few minutes ago. This economic security actually aligns with the recent security views of the international community, as economic security has been considered a key aspect of diplomatic work in various countries, rather than purely financial and trade issues. Also as evidence by the Biden administration's high-tech sanctions against China, the so-called small yard, high fence strategy. So that's the second point he tried to emphasize in the new administration. The third focus we can further go in detail is about Lai Ching-te's foreign policy. It's about this establishing partnerships with democratic countries worldwide. The priority of a future foreign policy from this new administration will be consolidating existing diplomatic allies and continue Taiwan-US cooperation, deepen relations with neighboring countries such as Japan and South Korea, and finally to expand exchange with European countries such as France. Due to the pressure from Chinese government, the form of exchange currently quite limited and can only start by deepening bilateral relationship between Taiwan and other countries, promoting projects with low political sensitivity in economic, social, and cultural fields in order to gain support for Taiwan's international participation. So I would say currently the Lai Ching-te's administration try to keep a low profile, but they try to increase Taiwan's international participation. They try every effort to improve that issue. Lastly, regarding policy towards China, President Lai Ching-te has made it clear in the past that he hopes for the cross-strait status quo to be maintained, but Taiwan must be respected equally and reciprocally. Unlike former President Tsai Ing-wen, I think what would be the major difference between Lai Ching-te and Tsai Ing-wen would be that President Lai Ching-te reminds Taiwan society that China is currently very unfriendly to Taiwan and poses the greatest security in the international community. This is not conducive to healthy cross-strait development. Therefore, you can see from in different scenarios or occasions, President Lai Ching-te emphasized that his new government operates on the principle of equality and does not intend to give up Taiwan's own status and rights for cross-strait exchange. However, I think since President Lai Ching-te's inauguration on May 20, China has completely ignored President Lai Ching-te's call and has continuously used military means to threaten the Taiwanese people, distorted the UN resolution 2758 internationally, and also impose economic sanctions on Taiwan after the election. China also used domestic laws to threaten to rule Taiwanese people, etc. Therefore, I think so far the cross-strait relations are still in a stalemate, it's unfortunately. So the above are my some thoughts for your reference. I will stop here because of this time limits, and we can discuss other issues later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hong Zhen. It's a very comprehensive overview of Lai Ching-te's foreign policy. So without further ado, I leave the floor to Susanna for giving us her perspective on the political scene in Taiwan, but also the potential of cooperation between Taiwan and the European Union. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark, and your team at IFRI for organizing today's event. It's really a pleasure to join you from Taipei. And so also thank you to Professor Wang for your comments. And I think it's great that you built out the foreign policy dimension of President Lai's promises, or and also what we can look forward in terms of what expectations the people of Taiwan can have vis-a-vis him, as also Europe. So what I would like to do is to kind of build on this and perhaps start with the broader picture of where we are in EU-Taiwan relations, and then see how we can connect the dots. So what I will do then in the next 10 minutes is to really unpack this new reality that I think has been emerging in EU-Taiwan relations, and kind of look at what are the factors that have really shaped this process in the current context. And so to begin, I think it's adequate to kind of adjust the question of why Taiwan matters. This is a question that I think the international community has been asking increasingly so in the past few years. But I think to adjust that to today's conversation, we can ask why Taiwan matters to Europe. But also, I think this is incomplete because there's also the question of why Europe matters to Taiwan. And I think asking that question is increasingly telling of where we are today, that EU-Taiwan relations have kind of consolidated into a partnership. And I think this also speaks to the fact that Europe has started seeing Taiwan more on its own merit and not through a China lens. Now, as much as we try to not see things in the Indo-Pacific through a China lens, obviously the China factor is the most significant, not in the way Europe sees Taiwan, but I see also in the way Taiwan sees itself. So Taiwan's own self-perception is also something that is very, I think, valuable to discuss, because it helps us understand how Taiwan sees its own relationship with China. So for me, as a European being in Taiwan since 2020, in particular, 2020 was a very important time globally speaking, because of COVID, but then it really intensified a lot of trends that we've seen in the EU-China and also EU-Taiwan context. So I think we are dealing right now with a partnership that both sides, both the European and the Taiwanese sides, really have the ability to shape. And I think that's another very important and often disregarded dimension of the conversation, that Taiwan has its own agency to exercise. And this is, again, important in how Beijing likes to frame the conversation between Europe and Taiwan as something that we are doing in light of what Washington does or does not do. So I think the question of agency when we look at Taiwan is also very important. And another point to raise here is that I think this relationship is also both values-based and interest-driven. So I think we are moving from celebrating each other's like-mindedness. That's usually the common agreement between Europeans and Taiwanese counterparts, that both sides believe in human rights, democracy, and rule of law. And this is something to celebrate, of course, for good reason, in particular in light of an assertive China. But it's also turning into something more pragmatic and more practical, I would say. So we are looking at how to expand this cooperation in light of an assertive China under a new president and administration in Taiwan, but also a dynamic European Union in light of a new parliament. And that's important because parliamentary diplomacy has been a key avenue to shape EU-Taiwan relations. So I think, I realize that this might sound extremely positive, that things are looking great, but to balance this with the reality on the ground, obviously we know that the one China policy remains the boundary as far as the European Union is concerned vis-a-vis Taiwan. And I think what we see as a development also is that there's more willingness from the European side to push back against those narratives coming out of Beijing that try to portray, again, EU-Taiwan relations as something that would violate our relations with China, whereas this is, as we know, not the case. And that is also because the EU and its member states do not, as they did not 5-10 years ago, and they do not today, take a position on Taiwan's status. I think that's a crucial point. What the European Union has been stressing, in particular in the context of the Indo-Pacific, is really how can Europe contribute to peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific, given that we recognize Taiwan's geostrategic relevance in the region, but we also recognize that the cross-strait relationship is increasingly tense and difficult, and perhaps as we are at the end of 8 years of fragile but still ongoing status quo under the leadership of Tsai Ing-wen, the questions that Europeans have been also asking is how things will change and what are the factors that can contribute to maintaining the status quo. So I think the shifting perceptions is part of the learning process between the Europeans and the Taiwanese side. And I think the question is, how can channels of communication be open? I use that as something that the Europeans also use vis-a-vis China, that Europe's relationship with China has become more complex and complicated and difficult, but the idea of keeping channels of communication with China is vital. And as a European based in Taiwan, I also asked the same question: how can the new administration under Lai Ching-te in a way return to dialogue? Because essentially that has been suspended for the past 8 years. And the question is, to what extent can Lai Ching-te navigate a more assertive China that we are likely to see, more assertive than in the past 8 years? I mean, I agree with you, Professor Wang, as you described the continuity dimension under Lai Ching-te, as he signaled before, as he ran as a candidate, and also when he was elected in January, his first address to the international press was very clear. I was in the room at the time when he said that this is a new chapter for Taiwan's democracy, but it's also, in a way, an extended hand vis-a-vis Beijing, where we are willing to have a conversation if this is done in dignity and on equal terms, as I think you also said. And this was also repeated after his inauguration. But as we know, and as both of you alluded to, this fact that we see that this, notwithstanding the element of continuity, we also see that the inauguration speech that we heard from Lai Ching-te was one that was more assertive, in particular because he mentioned the fact that the two sides are not subordinate to each other. And I think seeing this from within Taiwan, this was an element that a lot of us picked out as being a more assertive tone. And I think this is important because the inauguration speech set the tone for what we are likely to see. So we are not likely to see of course, I don't have a crystal ball, but we're not likely to see a softening of this as long as the PRC maintains an increasingly assertive and aggressive approach. But I think when it comes, just to return to the one thought I wanted to highlight is the value of parliamentary diplomacy. This has been something that under Tsai Ing-wen we saw really thrive, both from the Europeans and reciprocated from Taiwan. And I think this is something that I trust we'll see continue. Perhaps Professor Wang, you can also share your thoughts on that, because I think really, I don't mean to overestimate parliamentary diplomacy as a value, as a channel, but it's really important given that there is no government to government communication and is not likely to happen. I think that's going to be an open question, and also how the Taiwanese side will look at the region and how Taiwan can strengthen its own position and better position with itself in ASEAN. I think that's another focus for the current president, because we know that Southeast Asia is vital for Taiwan's regional ability to in a way strengthen its partnership and maintain the status quo. I mean, we know that the Philippines has been extremely or getting closer on the same page with Taiwan when it comes to pushing back against Chinese assertiveness. And perhaps I stop on this note of the pushback, because I think the positive out of all of this, that what I've noticed in the past 4 years, is really this willingness from the European side to really push back against not only false narratives that come out of Beijing, but also the economic security front that is extremely valuable. And I echo what Professor Wang said about how that is important for Taiwan, and that has been really the main channel for Europe to push back against unfair trade practices. So that is definitely a common interest, and that takes me back to what I said at the beginning, that it's not only the value of democracy that really connects the two sides, but it's really about Europe's interest in the region and also Taiwan's interest to keep Europe as close as possible. But to be realistic, that will come after the importance of the United States and also ASEAN and Japan in the region. So I stop here to allow more time for Q&A and an exchange. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diana. So I remind the audience to feel free to write down their questions in the Q&A chat box. We already have some question. I like also to pass on the question raised by Susanna on the parliamentary diplomacy to Hongzhen. If you can keep it in mind at some point, do you see any change or in the parliamentary diplomacy that rose to an unprecedented level under Tsai Ing-wen? So do you expect any change on that? Still on the international policy dimension, we have already 2 questions. The first one would be on how the Lai administration, something that both of you have raised already, how can the Lai administration talk or open up dialogue with Beijing? And so with Beijing on the one hand, but also with international actors. What do you see, Hongzhen, at the evolution on this side? And Susanna, you already touched upon the fact that Lai will have to or should return to dialogue, but I'm not sure that he really has the key to this dialogue, and he really doesn't really have the leverage. The question also is on Beijing part. Does Beijing is ever willing to talk to Lai Ching-te? And the other question is on the legislative yuan part, is if we agree or if it seems that it will be difficult for Lai Ching-te to talk to Beijing, perhaps that some other political stakeholders in Taiwan can. Within the Legislative Yuan, the Speaker of the Legislative Yuan, Han Guoyu, who comes from the KMT, who has much more perhaps, who pretend at least to have a more easy relations with Beijing. Could there be like a two layers dialogue? One which we will remain completely close at the official presidential level, but perhaps that the Legislative Yuan can have its own diplomacy. What do you think of that? I will let you respond to these first two questions, and I will come back with other ones. Hongzhen, if you'd like to start.
Yes. I think I have three questions raised by Mark. The first one, I guess, is about this parliamentary diplomacy. I totally agree with Professor Zasta's comments on this success of parliament diplomacy in exercise practice in the past 8 years. I didn't see any change. I didn't expect any change in Lai Ching-te's administrations. I think they will continue to promote this, especially to strengthen and increase those common ground between Taiwan and those European countries. Especially those countries from the eastern part. I think so far we already see the productive achievement between Taiwan and the countries such as Czech Republic and other countries. But the problem is the way how to maintain this relationship or partnership. I think it's not easy. So far, I think the strategy implemented by the MOFA or by the Taiwan government is try to emphasize those common values, such as rule-based international orders or rule-based universal values, which means that we don't specifically target on any specific countries such as China. The working common base between Taiwan and other countries will be on those universal common values. So I think that's much easier for those countries from European unions or from Europe. They can avoid this one China policy or one China principle pressure from Beijing government. So that's the first point. The second one, I think so far, I think the Lai Ching-te administration, they show their good intention to Beijing. But unfortunately, this good intention is not interpreted in a nice way by the Beijing government. So I think that's the problem. The way we can do so far is because we need to understand that I think President Lai Ching-te, he has his own personality. So for sure, he would be very different from, or he would be different from that of our previous president, Tsai Ing-wen. They have a totally different personalities. And for President Lai Ching-te, he knows that he has a diverse audience. So that's the reason why he doesn't target China as the own audience. He also has his support from the Taiwan society. So that means he doesn't want to give up or he doesn't want to cross this his basic line. That is to insist on Taiwan's autonomy or insist on Taiwan people's own rights. So he just, especially I think the interview with the Time magazine is quite important because in that interview, President Lai Ching-te shows that he just emphasized those realities already recognized by international society, by other countries around the world, except China. So he just want to emphasize that part. Unfortunately, that part has been interpreted as a better intention from the Taipei government. So I think the current government, they try to do some small steps to break this current deadlock between the two sides. So I just give you one example. Several weeks ago, the president of Strait Exchange Foundation, they invited a very famous entertaining actors from mainland China. So I think that's kind of a message from Taipei to try to break the ice between the two sides. Maybe it's not so successful in the end, but we still keep sending friendly messages from Taipei to mainland China. There are still a lot of work need to do, but so far, I think the Taipei government they try to make some compromise, even if it may not be interpreted as a big step from the mainland China. Okay, I will stop here. Thank you.
Yeah. Susanna, do you want to add anything?
Yes, thank you. So I agree mostly or entirely pretty much with Professor Wong. I think you ended on the word compromise, and I think that's the most difficult one because it's pretty clear that Beijing is not going to compromise on Taiwan in general, that we know, and I think no one's expecting anything. And I believe that underlie we will not see willingness to compromise on the most difficult issue, which is how the two sides relate to each other. And I think the line, I go back to what you said again, that the two sides are not subordinate to each other. I think this is the baseline. So if we try to look for compromise from that position, it's difficult. But at the same time, I know that this is most difficult on the highest level. And as you said, there are attempts to kind of try to depoliticize this or bring it at a lower level. And from, as you are in academia yourself, what I see is that there is actually quite a lot. Again, I can't judge what that means compared to a few years or pre-COVID times. You are in a better position to judge. But from what I see is a lot of my academic colleagues, friends, talk to me or go themselves to China, of course, on academic trips and exchanges. And I see this as also not insignificant in terms of maintaining content and also maintaining the exchange at that level. I mean, I know academia in a free society as Taiwan has a different meaning in a country such as China. So I know the value of academia, not the value of academia, but the room for academia to have an impact is not the same on the two sides. That's what I mean. But I see that as an example of exchange. And then, of course, we only are talking politics here, but we all know that the trade dimension of cross-strait relations is extremely important, and it's really the core of cross-strait relations when it comes to how the two sides relate to each other. And we know that for Taiwan, China is an important trade partner. The majority of Taiwan's outgoing investment still goes to China, as we know. I mean, this is a number that has increased in the past few years, in line with the international push and interest in diversification. And that's also what increased Southeast Asia and that the value of those relationships. But I think that's also something that we have to watch, how the two sides navigate the importance that they hold in each other, because it's not only Taiwan that has an over-reliance in exports and perhaps on China, but also China needs to have access to Taiwan-made semiconductors. And I think that's also important relationship for China. So I think it will be interesting to see how the two sides can navigate that. So another point I wanted to also echo that indeed the personality question is important. The relationship that Tsai Ing-wen had well, there was no relationship because there was no dialogue for 8 years, but the personality question is important. Under Lai, the two presidents have very different personalities, and also we are likely to see the two presidents approach the question of cross-strait relations very differently. But I think what another element I see that Lai has really emphasized is how Taiwan is part of the international community. So Taiwan is not a sub-question or a sub-chapter of China, but I think a core message of Lai's presidency so far, and it's been only a few weeks since his inauguration, is that, or perhaps a month, is that Taiwan is a member of the international community, and that's how the rest of the world needs to look at Taiwan. And I think this also sends an important message to Beijing, that Beijing cannot deal with this question, as they say, the Taiwan question, as a cross-strait question, because whatever happens to Taiwan has regional and global implications. And I think that's a very smart way for Lai to build on that image of Taiwan, because it brings also the rest of the region more into the conversation. And perhaps, again, it's important to send that message to Beijing, as much as you said, Professor Wang, that under Lai, we've seen also friendly messages. I think that's what you mentioned earlier. And I think we will have to see how these messages are being interpreted in Beijing. I stop here.
Thank you very much. Let's stay on the EU chapter with a few questions altogether. First of all, with as you said, Susanna, with the pushback in the European Union against China, especially on Taiwan, do you expect any further coercion coming from Beijing on the EU member states, but also perhaps on EU territories overseas? I'm thinking about French territories overseas. There have been some troubles in New Caledonia recently, and we know China's influence in this territory. So do you expect increased China pressure on the EU and EU member states about the Taiwan issue? The second question is about the values. Would you consider freedom of navigation and freedom of overflight as a value that the EU could defend in the context of the Taiwan Strait and Taiwan surrounding? And the last question on that would be, could the EU do more to promote peace and stability in the Strait, and what can it do more to do so? So if you can, Susanna, to start answering those three questions, and Hongzhen, if you want to follow up afterward.
Okay, thank you. Good questions. I'll try to really be brief because I think I tend to go on forever sometimes. But on the first question on coercion, I think the example and the lesson of how the EU responded to the coercion against Lithuania after Lithuania decided to step out of the 17+1 platform and strengthen ties with Taiwan. I think the response from the EU was also signaling to Beijing at the time that if it thinks to do so again in the future, it can expect a stronger pushback and a more united Europe. And I think the lesson, I would link that also to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the European unity in response to that, and China watching the international response and learning lessons, whatever lessons they are thinking of learning from this. I think these are all precedents that will shape Beijing's actions in the future. I also believe that having an anti-coercion instrument on paper and ready to be used by the EU is also a deterrent. I mean, that's how it was meant to be. And it's also meant to be as a last resort, because the first step is to always communicate. And I think the EU has been clear on that. So I am fairly positive on that I think we are strengthening the response. But I am very clear on the fact that we are not united on China in the EU, but I think this is a process that is going perhaps in the right direction. On what can the EU do to promote peace and stability in the region? I think, again, the EU's role, I mean, I get that question a lot in Taiwan, and I think the pushback, I go back to that pushback idea, how it's important for the EU to be sending consistent messages to Beijing that the EU is going to step and use the instruments it has in place and coordinate with like-minded partners in case it perceives its interests to be impacted by China's assertiveness. And I think it is a way to contribute to peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific by exposing attempts that Beijing has to disinform, to manipulate information. And again, this is not hardcore military stuff, but in terms of the impact of foreign information manipulation and interference in elections and the pushback that the EU has been leading, I think that is a way to contribute to keeping Beijing more aware and more aware of the fact that Europe is not going to sit by and watch China continue to undermine the international and freedom of navigation and peace and stability in the region. So I think compared to a pre-Russia invasion of Ukraine, pre-COVID, so I would go back to the 5-6 years. At this stage, I think we are in a better position as far as the EU is concerned to send the message. But again, whether Beijing is going to be deterred by that is still to be seen. But I think it will always be the first reaction from Beijing to react to anything that the EU tries to do in terms of strengthening its relationship with Taiwan. So the first thing will always be to denounce that as an anti-China, quote unquote, an anti-China gesture. And that's where I think the EU is doing better to push back that this is not anti-China. This is pro-European interest. This is this is in favor of our own interests, because that's what countries do to protect their own interests. So I stop here.
Do you want to follow up on that, or should I continue with the other question?
I'm actually having one follow-up question. Because we know that recent European Parliament election results show that the far-right voices have been some growth, and we also expect a new I think French government in the early July probably will tilt to the right, if not the far right. So I wonder if maybe Professor Susanna or Mark, you have any suggestion for the Taiwanese authority to prepare, have more interactions with this future far-right parliament or far-right European countries in the future? What do you have any thoughts on that? Thank you.
Actually, there were a question in the chat box by Professor Chloé Froissart in Paris, because there is another and the biggest elephant in the room on both sides of the Eurasian continent, which is the election in the United States. And so Chloé Froissart asked how Trump's potential re-election in November and the far-right turn in European democracies may affect the cooperation between Taiwan and liberal democracies. So actually, we also be glad for you, Hongzheng, to answer the question, how do you see Taiwan's cooperation with populist or far-right government in Europe or perhaps in the United States? And perhaps, Susanna, you can address this issue. I wouldn't perhaps go as far as to say that the European Parliament now is on the far right. Actually, the political landscape in Europe hasn't drastically changed after the European Parliament election. But as you are completely right that there is a drastic political change, at least in France. But it is perhaps too early to say what's going to come out of the next legislative election. So, Susanna, do you want to start on that?
Yes, just briefly. I mean, already, as you mentioned, Mark, it's not a drastic change. I think the largest European parliament, I mean, the largest group remains the European People's Party, which, if we look back at their record of the past 4 to 8 years, or the past two mandates, so that's 10 years, they have had actually a very, very strong position overall when it comes to China as well as Taiwan. They have made very strong statements. At the same time, we need to remember that it's a large group with a very different national delegations, and not all delegations are obviously on the same page. But I also trust that certain precedents have been set in the past mandate vis-a-vis Taiwan through parliamentary diplomacy. So I think when it comes to how this can go forward is really, as you said earlier, or perhaps President Lai said that that he wants to consolidate existing relations with allies and deepen relations with Europe. So again, I can only say that building on those existing relations will be important, but we also have to see how the new parliament will really, how the dynamics really will take shape, because we are still in the process of a lot of discussions. Also, the far right and the very right groups are different in different countries. So it's not like it's a united bloc. They are in two different families when it comes to the European Parliament. And there are still ongoing conversations. But I don't expect a radical move away from the tone that was set in the past mandate. And that is having a strong stance when it comes to China, not on its own, but watching closely how China relates to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and how the two issues are not in the same basket, but very much connected in the European perception. So I trust that that is not going to be drastically undermined, even if far right voices will be more strong, because I don't trust that the far right will be able to really unite and be able to really push a different line. So that's how I see it. But we'll have to, again, see how things will change.
Thank you, Susanna. Hongzhen, can you give us a very short word on
yes.
the potential re-election of Donald Trump in the White House?
Yes, I think because Taiwanese government, we had experiences before when dealing with Trump administrations. So we actually understand his policy, and we understand the Republican Party. Actually, Trump also circled by people who are advisors who are much friendly to Taiwan, and who has this strong anti-Chinese sentiment. So we keep in touch with those people around Trump, even if not Trump himself. But what I am trying to say is that I have a more comfortable and confidence in the future Taiwan-U.S. relationship after the November election in the United States, even if finally Trump elected to be the president. But we also need to prepare some kind of unpredictable risks in terms of how this new Trump administration will intervene or will influence the current cross-trade relations. So that's one thing we cannot make sure if Trump will change any. But I think so far he still try to say his policy toward both China and Taiwan is still keep this ambiguity of cross-trade relations policies. So that's the all the strategies implemented by each administrations in the past. So they try to not so clear about their policy both toward mainland China and Taiwan. But I think because his personality is his unpredictable thoughts, that's one risk. So we try to prepare in advance. In terms of so far, from what I know, we try to understand more about his. For example, there are upcoming debates between Trump and Biden. So we probably will know more in details about Trump's Asia policy, not only about Taiwan or China policy, but actually our neighboring countries such as South Korea and Japan, we share the same concerns about these unpredictable policy issues from this new government from the United States. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Within the few minutes that we have, I'd like to come back on the domestic political context in Taiwan and also the consequences on on Taiwan's foreign policy. So this recent domestic political instability, what risk can it bring to the current Taiwanese administration, to Lai Ching-te's administration, and how can it also affect the DPP's foreign policy? Do you see, Hong Zheng, any consequences, any impact on this legislative yuan political crisis on the Taiwanese foreign policy?
In theory, I think our system is very much like that of France and that of South Korea. So we call this semi-presidential system. So I think all of you already understand how this system works. So actually, the president always dominates, maintain its autonomy in foreign policy. And for Taiwan, President Lai enjoy these constitutional rights to dominate both foreign policy as well as cross-strait relation policy. So in that sense, I don't think the current problem in our Congress will actually make real threat to President Lai Ching-te's constitutional right. But the problem is it will influence the whole government's we call governability. I mean, that means I think Lai Ching-te, because 2 years later on or 4 years later on, Lai Ching-te, this new government need to prove to the Taiwanese society that this administration as a team can work very well, not only on foreign policy, right, but also on economic issues, on healthy issues, on other social security issues. So the legislative, the Congress so far make a trouble for Lai Ching-te to implement its commitment to the international to the Taiwanese society, what he made during the elections. So that's one problem. And the second problem is there's a conspiracy that the current opposition parties, two opposition parties actually work together, the blue one and the white one. They have some...
So the KMT and the TPP?
Yeah, KMT and the TPP actually, they use the name of Congress reform to try to show the Taiwanese society that they make good things for the government. But there's a conspiracy that they are negative side for their current actions, because that kind of makes some contribution to Beijing's intention to harass or to destroy Lai Ching-te's capability to run the government. So there's a conspiracy that the opposition parties, whether KMT or TPP, they privately work with the propaganda or the plan made by the Beijing government. Even if that's just a conspiracy, but some people in Taiwan, they believe that the opposition parties work with the Beijing regime to try to
just to be clear, you mean it is an actual conspiracy or a conspiracy theory?
It's a conspiracy theory. Yeah.
Okay.
For sure, we don't have any legal proof to say that they actually work together. But the results can make the advantage of the Beijing regime, because the intention of the Beijing regime is to prove that Lai Ching-te is not popular in the Taiwan society, because Lai Ching-te only gets 40% support. But that's not true to count this 40%. So that's another story. But I think the results kind of make very negative effects for the current administration.
Okay. Susanna, do you want to add anything on the domestic political scene?
Yes, I think Professor Wang really gave a comprehensive overview there. I think the main point here is that Taiwan remains an extremely polarized society, and amplification of polarization is something that Beijing is very much interested in, because it can divide society, not so much in a pro or anti-China way, but actually the China question is not as important in terms of the relationship with China, but really make society polarized, cause chaos, and as a result of that, make people's trust in their government, in the new government, in Lai and his ability to govern, and weaken that trust. And that really helps Beijing's interest. So I think whether the conspiracy is there or the conspiracy theory is there, I mean, there's a lot of discussion that there's with advanced technology, there's so many ways to amplify that polarization, but obviously to sow the seed of distrust is something that can be amplified with that technology. And I think that is something that we are seeing in terms of the recent crisis, is something that it gives us a taste of what we can expect, unfortunately, with Lai as a president without having the majority in the parliament. And that's something that is really only in Beijing's interest, unfortunately.
Thank you very much. We will have to stop here because we are already running out of time. I'm very sorry for the question that I couldn't ask our two speakers. Some very interesting questions, including one on how Taiwan sees the Russian war for aggression on Ukraine, which I think I can safely say that Taiwan is supporting Ukraine very clearly. And the war also had a huge impact on the defense and military mindset in Taiwan and led to some reforms, including the military service reform. So this is a very important question in Taiwan. Many other questions that I cannot, that I don't have time to elaborate on and to raise. But thank you very much to all the audience for your active participation. And thank you so much, Professor Wang, Dr. Ferenczi, for spending some time with us and explaining what's happening right now in Taiwan and the perspective for EU-Taiwan relations, which is a consequential relationship today and for the coming months and years. Thank you very much. Have a great afternoon, a great day in Europe, and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you, Marcus. Thank you, Professor Susanna. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both and your team and everyone. And I'll see you in Taipei, Professor Wang.
Thank you.
See you. For sure. See you. Bye.